Hey folks, I'm JB Shreve with the Faithful Considerations podcast, and we are in episode 11 of our Kings and Prophets podcast series, looking today at the life and the ministry of the prophet Elisha. So I mentioned at the close of the last episode that as we look into the stories of Elisha's life, these stories aren't in order. When you read through this in 2 Kings and you see the stories about Elisha, they're just not in order. These are vignettes. They're famous stories about the prophet as he worked, as he ministered in the northern kingdom of Israel and Samaria for the next half century of his life. And we see this happen at other times in Scripture. This isn't like an isolated incident. Whenever it's really obvious, then we know, whenever the timing, whenever it's obvious that it's not in chronological order, we know then that the message God's wanting to show us in this Scripture is not revealed in the chronology, but in the themes. So keep that in mind as we look today at these stories from Elisha's life today, okay? So the first place I want to go to is a couple of, I'll call them co-stars within the Elisha story. They have recurring appearances in these stories. And the first is the Shunammite woman, and the second is Elisha's servant Gehazi, all right? Now, let's start in 2 Kings chapter 4, verses 8 to 10. It says, "Now it happened one day that Elisha went to Shunem, where there was a notable woman, and she persuaded him to eat some food. So it was, as often as he passed by, he would turn in there to eat some food. And she said to her husband, 'Look, now, I know that this is a holy man of God who passes by us regularly. Please let us make a small upper room on the wall, and let us put a bed for him there, and a table and a chair and a lampstand, so it will be whenever he comes to us, he can turn in there.'" That's 2 Kings 4, verses 8 to 10. Now, the Shunammite woman, she's an interesting character. She's not a widow like the woman that Elijah stayed with during his years of the famine. She's married, apparently well-to-do. Her husband's always in the background. He doesn't seem very engaged or active in any parts of the stories that follow, but she's an honorable, a notable woman, and that she goes out of her way, even beyond anything Elisha has requested, to make a home for this prophet. That had to be an important gift to this prophet who's so, Elisha we already looked at, he's very relational. So that had to be important, significant to him. She's pictured as one of the first who wholly embraces the call of Elisha. She never doubts him, never at all. She made ready a small upper room in her house, and her husband and Elisha regularly visited there. Now the provision of a table and a chair, a lampstand in that passage there, it's simply describing her hospitality and how she went out of her way to make sure that Elisha, the prophet, felt at home there. And so after a period of time in which she had provided so much care and support to Elisha, and his servant Gehazi for that matter, Elisha felt they should do something to repay her for her kindness. And it's really important to notice the way this is all worded here, because this plays into the issues that arise not only with the Shunammite woman, but also with Elisha's servant Gehazi. All right, so this is 2 Kings 4, verse 11 to 16. It says, "And it happened one day that he came there, and he turned into the upper room and lay down there. Then he said to Gehazi his servant, 'Call the Shunammite woman.' When he had called her, she stood before him. And he said to him, 'Say now to her.'" Now notice, Elisha's talking through Gehazi, all right? She's standing right there, but he's relaying the message through Gehazi. And he said to him, "Say now to her, 'Look, you have been concerned for us with all this care. What can I do for you? Do you want me to speak on your behalf to the king or to the commander of the army?' She answered, 'I dwell among my own people.' So he said, 'What then is to be done for her?' And Gehazi answered, 'Actually, she has no son, and her husband is old.' So he said, 'Call her.' When he had called her, she stood in the doorway. Then he said, 'About this time next year, you shall embrace a son.' And she said, 'No, my lord, man of God, do not lie to your maidservant.'" Now, what I want to call out from that passage is what I just called out, right? Elisha never talks directly to the Shunammite woman. This is a lady he cares for. He's noting her hospitality, her servant's heart, her self-sacrifice to provide for him and his servant. So why does he not talk directly to her? It's not a cultural issue. A lot of people through the years have believed that that's what's going on here. But in the story, just before this one, he's actually talking to a widow woman who was married to one of the sons of the prophets, and he talked directly to that woman. I think the story right here is conveying a hidden reality about something that was just slightly amiss in the people who worked with Elisha. And I think that thing that's amiss is Gehazi. All right. For whatever reason, Elisha's servant Gehazi, he had created this space around the prophet. Wherever Elisha was naturally approachable. All right. But Gehazi was making him kind of less so. He was building space between the prophet and the people. And this will prove out more as we continue through these stories. The Shunammite woman, she ended up having a child, obviously. The child grew into a boy, and one day he's in the field helping his father, and the boy becomes sick. She tried to get her husband to go for help, but the husband's just a pretty passive dude. So the Shunammite woman took matters into her own hands. And I'm going to pick up here. This is 2 Kings chapter 4, picking up at verse 25. I'm going to read through verse 31. So it was, when the man of God saw her afar off, he said to his servant Gehazi, now this is Elisha, okay? He said to his servant Gehazi, look, the Shunammite woman, please run now to meet her and say to her, is it well with you? Is it well with your husband? Is it well with your child? And she answered, it is well. Now when she came to the man of God at the hill, she caught him by the feet, but Gehazi came near to push her away. You notice what's happening there. But the man of God said, let her alone, for her soul is in deep distress, and the Lord has hidden it from me and has not told me. Another key line right there. So she said, did I ask a son of my Lord? Did I not say, do not deceive me? Then he said to Gehazi, get yourself ready and take my staff in your hand and be on your way. If you meet anyone, do not greet him, and if anyone greets you, do not answer him, but lay my staff on the face of the child. And the mother of the child said, as the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, I will not leave you. So he arose and followed her. Now Gehazi went on ahead of them, and laid the staff on the face of the child, but there was neither voice nor hearing. Therefore he went back to meet him, and told him, saying, the child has not awakened. Okay, so pretty easy to track right there. Do you see how Gehazi, he keeps imposing himself in between the Shunammite woman and Elisha? It seems like it's Elisha's idea, but this servant, he's kind of real subtly imposing himself between Elisha and the people around him. When she comes to them to tell her of the issue, Gehazi steps between them. She has to literally work around him to get to Elisha. Elisha realizes something's really wrong with her, and when she tells him what's happened, he directs her to head home immediately, and he'll go with her. Nothing will get between him and her need here, right? But then Gehazi, he actually tries to do just that. Gehazi goes ahead of Elisha. He even tried to work the healing on the boy, on his own, on the boy, but he was ineffective. He reports back to Elisha, before Elisha has even arrived, that the boy is not waking up. Notice also that Elisha points out that the Lord has kept hidden from him what's going on with the woman and her child. The prophet, he's kind of perplexed by this. Why doesn't he see this? This is not normal for him. He's recognizing something's off. Something's not working right here. Why am I surprised by this news? Why didn't I already know about this? This is Elisha's first hint that something's wrong. Not just with the Shunammite woman, not just with her son. Something's off with his spiritual sight, with his very prophetic capacity. He goes there and he heals the boy. And from there, he speaks directly to the Shunammite woman, but it'll be a minute before he realizes that it's actually Gehazi who's interfering with his prophetic frequency. It's like he's not picking up the full frequency from God that he was meant to, because Gehazi keeps getting in the way. All right? The stories go on, but we arrive to the story of Naaman the leper. Remember, these aren't in order, but we get to the story of Naaman the leper. And this is where Elisha finally figures out what the problem is. Now, Naaman the leper, he's another of the famous stories of Elisha's miracles. All right. This guy is an officer, not in the Israelite army, but in the Syrian army. He's known for being a very honorable guy, very noble, in spite of the fact that he was a foreigner and even an invader of Israel. He's also known for being, obviously, a leper, Naaman the leper, right? Jewish law had specific protocols for people afflicted with leprosy, but they weren't the only ones. Throughout the ancient world, leprosy, it was a mark of uncleanness and danger, and it greatly affected the quality of life for anyone who had that skin disease. Well, at some point along the way, Naaman, during one of his invasions of Israel, he had actually taken an Israelite girl captive during one of those incursions into the land, and he made her his servant. Well, the servant girl mentions once that Naaman, he ought to find the prophet Elisha, and Elisha could heal him of this leprosy. So Naaman goes to his king, and he makes the request. The Syrian king, in turn, he sends a letter to the king of Israel and Samaria, noting, he says, hey, I'm going to send this army officer, Naaman, to Israel so that he can be healed. It's, it's kind of a humorous misunderstanding, but the king of Israel, Samaria, he kind of freaks out at this letter when he gets it. How's he supposed to heal Naaman? All right. He suspects this is all a plot for the king of Syria to use as a justification for war. Luckily, Elisha gets word of this and directs the king to send Naaman to him. This is 2 Kings chapter 5, verses 9 to 12. Then Naaman went with his horses and chariot, and he stood at the door of Elisha's house. And Elisha sent a messenger to him, saying, Go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored to you, and you shall be clean. But Naaman became furious and went away, and said, Indeed, I said to myself, he will surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God, and wave his hand over the place and heal the leprosy. Are not the Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean? So he turned and went away in a rage. Now, I really like this story. It shows us how even a good and honorable man like Naaman, and we know he was good and honorable because the Bible tells us he was, but even a good and honorable man can be blinded because of pride. In Naaman's example, it was the national pride that blinded him. You can see that pretty clearly in the story, right? The Syrians had their own prophets, but their prophets weren't like Elisha and the prophets of the true God. Their prophets did whatever their king wanted. They backed the king. They affirmed the king. So that's when Naaman arrives in Israel. He expects the prophets of Israel to act that same way, but that's not the way it works. The true prophets of God don't serve at the king's pleasure. They serve God. That means they don't owe their allegiance to any man. When Naaman arrives at Elisha's house, this Syrian officer, he doesn't even get out of his chariot. He remains there. He anticipates there's going to be this great reception by the prophet of Israel. But Elisha doesn't even show for Naaman's visit. He just sends word by another messenger. He says, go take a bath in the Jordan River. It's rude. It's uncouth. The thing is, we know that Elisha was none of those things, but that's the way it came across, right? He was actually a really gracious guy. But God was doing more here than just healing Naaman of his leprosy. He was getting to the heart of the man and showing us that God's interested in all the nations, not just Israel, as he extends these efforts and steps to heal even a foreign invader. Naaman's furious at the perceived insult. Never getting out of the chariot, he turns with his retinue and heads north to depart Israel. Who knows what his anger, his perceived slight, will fuel, perhaps even another invasion of Israel. But as he drives, his servants try to calm him down there in his chariot or in whatever he was riding in. They say, if the prophet had told you to do something really difficult, would you have done it? Why not at least try and let's see what happens? So Naaman does it. He pulls his chariot alongside the Jordan River. He disrobes, he steps into the water, he takes a bath, and to his astonishment, he's totally healed, right? He's totally healed right there on the spot. The scripture says his skin was like the skin of a baby. Now, Naaman is obviously thrilled. He recognizes his own pride, his own potentially self-damaging, self-sabotaging blindness. Having experienced the healing, he and his servants, his aides, they load back up and they go back to Elisha's house, to the place where Elisha is staying. 2 Kings 5, verse 15 to 16, it says, And he returned to the man of God, he and all his aides, and came and stood before him, and said, Indeed, now I know there is no God in all the earth except in Israel. Now therefore, please take a gift from your servant. But he said, this is Elisha, As the Lord lives, before whom I stand, I will receive nothing. And he urged him to take it, but he refused. Now, much more humble now, Naaman thanks Elisha, he honors God, and he offers a gift to the prophet. But Elisha refuses the gift repeatedly. In Naaman's country, this is how one honored the prophets. Elisha wants the honor going to God alone. And that's why he multiple times refuses this gift. That's the point that Elisha is wanting to bring home to this Syrian officer. Well, Naaman leaves Elisha, informing the prophet. He says, hey, I'm gonna plan to take some soil from Israel so that even in my own country, I can stand on that soil and worship the one true God that you serve. Elisha approves, and that would seem to be the end of the story, except for Elisha's servant Gehazi. This is 2 Kings 5, verse 20 to 21. It says, But Gehazi, the servant of Elisha, the man of God, said, Look, my master has spared Naaman this Syrian while not receiving from his hands what he bought. or what he brought. But as the Lord lives, I will run after him and take something from him." So Gehazi pursued Naaman. When Naaman saw him running after him, he got down from his chariot to meet him and said, "Is all well?" Now, note the posture of Naaman right here. Gehazi is being awarded honor that's not his in more ways than one right here. Having arrived to Naaman's chariot, Gehazi informs the Syrian military officer that Elisha has changed his mind and in fact recognized that the financial gift from Naaman would actually come in handy for taking care of all the prophets. Now, who knows how long Gehazi has been up to this type of business? The comfort, the ease with which he lied and stole right here in this story suggests it probably wasn't the first time he's done this. Within the ranks of Elisha's inner circle, there's actually corruption right here. Naaman gives Gehazi a small treasure, and Gehazi returns to Elisha only to find Elisha looking at him, but he's looking at him a little differently this time. 2 Kings 5, verse 25 says, "Now he went in and stood before his master. Elisha said to him, 'Where did you go, Gehazi?' And he said, 'Your servant did not go anywhere.'" Well, now it begins to make sense. Every prophet of God has their own unique frequency in which God speaks to them. And later in 2 Kings, we'll learn that Elisha was able to hear even what went on in the households of foreign kings. He has a very unique, a very distinct and different type of frequency in how God talks to him. That was his prophetic, part of his prophetic flow. He could perceive things unfolding without even being there. Well, that's one of the reasons why he was so surprised by the Shunammite woman's tragedy. It was hidden from him somehow, and most things were not hidden from him. And because his spirit followed his servant Gehazi on this day, because his suspicions were finally aroused, well, we don't know what changed, but that's what Elisha decided to do that day. He looked in, his spirit followed Gehazi. However he does that, however this prophet operates, he managed to get it done. And Elisha responded to Gehazi, "Did not my heart," this is after Gehazi's denied going anywhere, he said, "Did not my heart go with you when the man turned back from his chariot to meet you?" Well, Gehazi's at last found out. Elisha pronounces a curse on the servant. The leprosy that once afflicted Naaman is now going to afflict Gehazi. The scripture says that the servant walked out of Elisha's presence white as snow that day. That's a symptom of leprosy right there. And it's real interesting what happens from this point. The immediate next story is about a building project among the school of the prophets where Elisha stayed. They were running out of space all of a sudden. They needed to increase their dwelling. Well, why would that be? Probably because more Israelites were joining their ranks now. Once Gehazi was gone, the school of the prophets began to grow. In Jewish rabbinic tradition, there was this, it's called the Gehazi effect, that persisted as long as the servant was with Elisha. Gehazi, he's well connected. He knew people. He was a networker, but he's also very corrupt. And throughout his time with Elisha, he created barriers for the people in their approach to the prophet. As we saw that with the Shunammite woman, right? God was wanting to use Elisha to show his approachability, not just to the prophet, but to God himself in Israel. Well, Gehazi warped all of that. He warped that with his own sense of importance and that corruption that he was bringing into the scenarios, into the picture. Once Gehazi was banished, it's like the dam broke open and the ranks of those who lived and followed among the prophets, it began to fill up. Later in 2 Kings chapter 8, we find the story of Gehazi and the Shunammite woman. Once again, they intersect. This is years later, and Gehazi, although afflicted with leprosy permanently now, he's banished from Elisha's presence, and he's now one who entertains the king of Israel, right? This is how well connected this guy does it. Now, how does he entertain the king of Israel? He entertains by telling stories about his years of traveling with Elisha and all the incredible things he saw and experienced. The king of Israel loves this stuff, and Gehazi has basically become really just a storyteller for the king. He's still well connected in his networks, but he's forfeited his calling to something that could have been so much more significant than it ended up being, right? During the years that had passed, the Shunammite woman and her family had moved out of Israel. There was a famine that struck the land. She moved away. Their family moved away. Well, Elisha recommended the move, and he also advised when they should come back. Unfortunately, when they returned home, they found their land was now occupied by another person. So they approached the king of Israel to address the matter, And who do they find there? There's Gehazi in the king's court, right? The storyteller for the king. He says, do you remember the story? To the king, he says this. Do you remember the story about the boy that Elisha raised from the dead? That's what he says to the king. And he says, this is him. This is the young boy now become a man. And that story, as he tells it to the king, excites the king, and it actually triggers the woman, the Shunammite woman, getting her land back. Real quickly, I want to put a plug in for listeners who are enjoying this podcast series. Did you know that we have other podcast series out there? In fact, this series is actually a sequel to a series we did on King David, which covers the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel. We usually present these series to the public, and then after a while, they're archived and available exclusively to our Patreon supporters. So for as little as $1 a month, you can sign up and support this podcast, and that'll give you access to things like the Days of David series, that podcast series. But that's not all. That also gives you access, that Patreon supporting, Patreon sponsorship. It also gives you access to other podcast series that we've done at our partner website, theendofhistory.net. Faith-based perspectives on historical and current events, as well as major social and political issues of the day. So all that's included when you're a Patreon supporter. And wait, that's not all. Our Patreon supporters are also invited to join our Insiders group. This is a unique social media group of people tracking the news, tracking the issues of the day, with an eye on the question, what's God doing behind all of this? It's a really cool way to stay informed, stay up to date. Every weekday we send out 5 good reads in the morning that features like headlines from different news outlets from around the world that you might want to check out so you can be aware, can be informed of what's going on in the world around you. So this podcast right here, this podcast series, it's free to stream, free to download. But if you're looking for ways to get more, ways to support what we're doing here, sign up as a Patreon supporter. You can find links to that in the show notes for this episode at jbshreve.com or by going to patreon.com/jbshreve. So as we get into the stories of Elisha, it's really incredible how active he was across the spectrum of society. On the one hand, he's almost like a social worker. He's engaging in the needs of the people who need their water supply healed in Jericho, or their son healed, in the case of the dead son with the Shunammite woman. On the other hand, he's deeply engaged in Israel's geopolitics of the day. This was a time, and you got to recognize this reality. It was a time when Israel was really falling on hard times, right? All these things were related: the poverty, the instability afflicting the land and the people. It's a direct effect of the chaos that's beginning to spread across the country, across the land, right? When I read these stories, I see the active hands of God on both sides. God is demonstrating through Elisha his active engagement with the people. He's wanting to minister to their needs. He's wanting to present and be active in their lives. At the same time, God's also orchestrating the crisis, the events on the national and the international stage. As he shared with Elijah on Mount Horeb, destruction's coming. Israel's trajectory is already set. On the social work side, there's multiple stories. They usually consist of just like a few verses, and then we're on to the next story when it comes to Elisha. For example, we find the story of Elisha and the widow and the widow's oil in 2 Kings chapter 4. This is 2 Kings 4, verse 1. A certain woman of the wives of the sons of the prophets cried out to Elisha, saying, "Your servant, my husband, is dead, and you know that your servant feared the Lord, and the creditor is coming to take my 2 sons to be his slaves." Now, just back away from that story for a second and consider the incredible injustice within the situation. A defenseless widow is in danger of seeing her sons literally sold into slavery because of the debts her husband had accumulated and was unable to pay off due to his untimely death. Well, that's a telltale sign right there of the corruption and dysfunction within that society. Keep in mind, this is the society of Israel, a people, a place where God had given his law that was meant to fashion a just society where that widow, those orphans, and the stranger would be cared for. How far had they slipped? Later, when we get to some of the other prophets like Amos and Isaiah, keep those events in mind as the specific description of how God viewed the nations of Judah and Israel and Samaria, because they pretended to worship him even while they were letting the weaker people in society suffer. All right? That's not okay in the mind of God. That's not okay in the eyes of God. Notice also that this was a widow from among the sons of the prophets, or the school of the prophets, as we've been identifying them. She was from among Elisha's own spiritual community. Now, a lot of commentators have focused on how Elisha performed this miracle with the oil and the closing of the door and such. All right, I'm going to start in verse 2. So Elisha said to her, "What shall I do for you? Tell me, what do you have in the house?" And she said, "Your maidservant has nothing in this house but a jar of oil." Then he said, "Go borrow vessels from everywhere, from all your neighbors, empty vessels. Do not gather just a few. And when you have come in, you shall shut the door behind you and your sons, then pour it into all those vessels and set aside the full ones." So she went from him and shut the door behind her and her sons, who brought the vessels to her, and she poured it out. Now it came to pass, when the vessels were full, she said to her son, "Bring me another vessel." And he said to her, "There is not another vessel." So the oil ceased. Then she came and told the man of God, and he said, "Go sell the oil and pay your debts, and you and your sons live on the rest." Now, to me, that the big point is not how the miracle was done right here. This was an honorable woman. Elisha is empowering her to utilize what she does have when he asked her, what do you got in your house? She has no possessions, but she does have some social credit. The people know her as a woman of honor, one who can be trusted. So build on that. Let's engage there and present that before God for him to bless. That's what she does, and the issue gets resolved. This miracle of all this supply of oil comes in, and then she begins to sell it. Once she's paid off all the debts, she lives on the rest. That's the way God sets up this miracle. That's pretty cool, right? That's social worker Elisha right there. There's another miracle later on where he miraculously feeds 100 men, and that reminds us of Jesus feeding the 5,000. Right, from later on. And another instance, again, this one featured within the community of this school of the prophets, Elijah is curing a case of food poisoning. Think about that. Something, it seems like so minor, is included right there in Scripture. Another one later on involves the floating of an axe head. That one's recorded in 2 Kings 6. And the focus should not be on how the miracle was done. All right? The people focus on this, and I really don't understand why. How do you explain a miracle? By definition, a miracle defies the laws of reasons and of physics. It's not about how the miracle was done. It's about why was it necessary in the first place. This one, again, occurs within the context of the spiritual community or of this school of the prophets. They're adding on to their dwelling, and they lose an axe in the Jordan River. And the cry of the guy with the axe is, "Alas, master, for it was borrowed." So the core issue, the core concern here is once again economics and debt. It was something loaned, something borrowed. This was a time when the haves are preying on the have-nots in Israel, right? Or at least preying on the have-not as muches, right? There's classism, class warfare going on here. It's really not too unlike today when you really think about it. Elisha is engaging on all these fronts in the individual tragedies and struggles that would often oppress and even crush the individuals within Israel who are living amid the judgment that God had already said was coming. We have to remember that the reign of Ahab during the days of Elijah, it represented a wicked period, but also the peak years of Israel and Samaria's economy, their politics. Things were going well on the outside, the externals of life. It was internal where the idolatry, the opposition to God was found, and that's what God judged. After Ahab, the kingdom began to experience a sharp decline. Elijah brought the justice, and Elisha's half-century-long mission helped stabilize the righteous people of the land as that justice began to descend and impact their ways of life. Now, in our next episode in this series, I want to continue to look at the life and ministry of Elisha. Today, we looked at how he cared for the people, the society of Israel. Next week, we're going to look at how he engaged in the geopolitical sphere, because that was also very significant in the ministry and the life of Elisha. That's coming next week in our next episode in the Kings and Prophets podcast series from J.B. Shreves and Faithful Considerations podcast. Go to jbshreve.com and sign up for our newsletter today. Thanks for listening, everyone.